It's July 4th, 2020. Happy birthday, America. Today we celebrate the 244th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's amazing how many Americans believe that today celebrates the end of the Revolutionary War. They apparently don't teach that in school anymore. I'm of an age where I was in elementary school when we celebrated the bicentennial, 1976. So I got at least 3 years of revolutionary history. Didn't get a whole lot more other history, but I did get a lot of revolutionary history. And then later, I had the opportunity to make friends with various individuals. And I found out that history is not nearly as clean as people would like it to be. If you have watched any or read any historic material about the Revolution, you've probably heard about a group called the Sons of Liberty. And typically in historical dramas, certainly in the movies, I want to say in 1776, they are portrayed as a bunch of heroic young men who went out and did good deeds for the country. Well, okay. As they say, history is written by the victor. And yes, while they did actually do a lot of things in the name of independence from England, they are what we would consider today a terrorist group. They went to the houses of governors and other crown officials, pulled them out of bed, tarred and feathered them, and among other things, up into including murder. Revolution is messy, and it is not something to be taken lightly. One of the facts of the Declaration of Independence, while it was mainly written by Thomas Jefferson with help from Ben Franklin and a few others, it was signed by a group of men, because, let's face it, at that point, men were the ones who had all the power. And they understood that they were signing their death warrant if this revolution didn't work out. They put their names to a document that, had the Revolutionary War gone the other way, would have been proof, more than adequate proof, of treason against the crown. Now, today we have a bunch of radicals who have similar thoughts against the U.S. government, against the pieces of the U.S. government. We have radicals who, not only in the public, but in government, who want to defund the police of various cities. They'd like to defund the police of every city. A society without law is not a society. Ask the Romans after the Visigoths visited. Our country at this point in time is facing grave danger. Not that it hasn't faced it before, not that it hasn't faced it for a long time. As I said, I'm of an age where I remember certain things. One of those things I remember is the Red Menace. Now, I'm not old enough to remember the height of the Red Scare back in the 50s, but I was born in 64, so I grew up during the Vietnam War, and the whole idea that if we didn't fight that war, the Russians were somehow going to win because country after country after country would fall to communism. 20 years later, President Reagan broke the communist bloc by outspending them. Literally. The Star Wars initiative was never meant to be, well, everybody called it the Star Wars initiative. It was I don't remember what the actual name of it was, but the whole idea was never to create technology, a giant laser shield that would protect us from incoming missiles. It was to cause the Russians to spend more and more money, because President Reagan knew that he had the ability, because the dollar was not pegged to anything like gold. He had the ability to create as much money as he needed to outspend the Russians and create new technologies, which we have done. GPS is because of Star Wars, of the Star Wars initiative. The Russians didn't have the money and didn't have the capability of creating the money to spend what America did. And so therefore they literally went bankrupt. Today we have protests, and I put them in air quotes because a great many of them are not really protests. They are riots, or quickly turn into riots, where people decide to cause property damage to businesses, breaking windows, stealing items, setting buildings on fire, tearing down statues because they don't like what they might represent. I find it interesting that the Democrats are tearing down, these massive mobs of Democrats are tearing down statues of Civil War generals when it was the Democrats who put them up in the first place. Here in Denver, we had a Civil War statue torn down. The problem is that the statue was to the Union soldiers. So it's obvious that these protesters have no understanding of history or just don't care. And B, are simply trying to create chaos. The unfortunate part is that most of them, I suspect, are clueless about what they're doing and why they're doing it. This is the nature of the mob. I'm willing to bet it would surprise 95% of the protesters across the country who are holding up signs saying Black Lives Matter. I'm willing to bet that 95% of them don't know that the founders of Black Lives Matter are not only avowed Marxists, but trained Marxists, and admittedly so. I have a couple of articles that I will link in the description below so that you can take a look at it and judge for yourself. I'm a big believer that you should never take anything I or anyone else says on its own merit. Do your own research. You've got the internet. You have the ability. You have the same ability I do, or anyone else does, to do your own research. Find out for yourself what's really going on. So the two founders of Black Lives Matter are avowed Marxists. They believe that our country is... they believe that Russia had the right idea, that China still does, that Cuba does. All of these communist nations are the way to go. And if it's not working in those countries, if communism, socialism isn't working in those countries, it's simply because those countries didn't implement it properly. This is the excuse that the socialists have for the fact that socialism, communism has never worked. Well, they just didn't do it properly. Among those socialists are leaders in Washington, AOC, and her squad. One of the first things she did when she got to Washington was she and a bunch of other Democrats got together and drew up this non-binding resolution they called the Green New Deal. They understood enough about history to name it for something that people would be aware of, the New Deal. The New Deal came about when FDR was elected president after the stock crash of '29. And it is the reason that the Depression lasted 10 years. Most people don't realize that, don't understand that. They think that the New Deal saved America. It didn't. It condemned it to 10 years of deflation and depression. Her Green New Deal would not only do that, it had, she touts it as a plan to get America on green energy. And is some talk of green energy, solar and wind farms at the very beginning. But for the most part, it is nothing more than a manifesto, socialist manifesto, of how the government can take control. In there, she talks about every building being retrofitted with solar energy. She doesn't say every public building. She says every building. That means your house. Well, okay, if the government's going to mandate that your house has to have solar power, who's paying for it? The government? Or are they going to make you buy solar for your house, whether you can afford it or not, whether you want it or not? I mean, I'm all for renewable forms of energy. I think they're a wonderful thing. The problem is that they're not in a state where they're actually usable. Not completely, not totally, not exclusively. And the one type of power that is green, that has no real pollution, with an exception, the Democrats won't allow. They don't like nuclear energy. It's absolutely green, aside from the nuclear waste, but that's can be taken care of. That we take care of that all the time anyway. We have places to store that's safe and out of the way. Not only did she introduce the Green New Deal, but she has recently introduced a new bill that is actually, it's a list of 6 bills that collectively she calls a just society. And in these 6 bills, and I will put links to the text of the Green New Deal as well as information on this just society. The first bill, a just society, recognizes and eradicates poverty. Imagine that. The Recognizing Poverty Act. All of these sound... That's the other thing about government. Whenever they want to pass something that is harmful to the public, they always name it so that it sounds really good. The Recognizing Poverty Act directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services, in collaboration with the Bureau of the Census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, contract with the Committee on National Statistics. This is government stuff. It's never straightforward. It's always convoluted. So it directs them to propose a new official poverty guideline. This guideline would account for costs related to geographic variation, health insurance, childcare, and new necessities, such as internet access. Now, I agree, the internet is a necessity. That doesn't mean the government should pay for it. Doesn't mean it should be free. I might go so far as to say it's become a utility, but the government shouldn't be paying for those either. This would ensure the accuracy of our current poverty measure, which determines eligibility for much of the social safety net, including Medicaid, food stamps, family planning services, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and the National School Lunch Program. So basically, she again believes the government has the ability to eradicate poverty. The government has no such power, never has. There has been a war on poverty for, most of my life? Certainly since the 1960s. Have we gotten rid of poverty? No, because government can't do that. Government can't do anything. All the government can do is spend money. It's not the function of government to eradicate poverty. That's the function of the market. The market is what gets rid of poverty. The second of this series of bills, six bills, the Place to Prosper Act, would protect low-income tenants and rein in corporate landlords. I guess if you own more than 2 properties, you're a corporate landlord because you're making passive income from rentals. It would do this by, among other things, creating an access to council fund for renters facing eviction, imposing a 3% national cap on annual rent increases, and imposing disclosure requirements on the nation's largest landlords. So basically what she wants to do is, instead of the market determining how much your rent goes up, which in this last market, rents went up hugely, very quickly, but then so did the value of your property. And that's the way markets work. But again, markets, we're about to go through we're in a deflationary period. The prices of houses and rents are going to drop. We're going to go through another period like 2008 where those who bought at the top of the market are going to find themselves upside down in their mortgages, and they're going to walk away. And suddenly the bottom is going to fall out of the housing, and that will cause rents to drop as well. But she'd like to keep it to no more than 3% a year. You can't increase the rents more than 3% a year. Well, okay, so that is government rent control. That never works. Go to New York. See how well that works. New York City has rent control. It doesn't work. If you have walked around anywhere in any of the boroughs that have rent control, what you'll find are rats the size of cats, trash everywhere, because the landlords don't have the ability to attract people who will take care of the properties. The third bill, the Mercy and Reentry Act, basically ensures that notwithstanding any other provision of law, an individual may not be denied any federal public benefit solely on the basis that the individual was convicted of a criminal offense. Well, okay. I agree that if a person has been convicted and has served their time, they have paid their debt. I have no problem with the concept. It's the execution I have a problem with, because none of this comes without consequences. The fourth of these 6 bills, the Embrace Act, ensures that, notwithstanding any other provision of law, an individual may not be denied any federal public benefits solely on the basis of the individual's immigration status. Meaning that you cross the border, you're illegally or not, you can apply for benefits from the federal government and get them. Because the fact that not only are you not a citizen, but you're here illegally, you've broken the law to come here, that's okay. Fine, we'll give you whatever you like. Now, how is that going to go across? Well, when we had those surges on the border where hundreds of thousands of people were coming across the border each month into California, the reason that the numbers were so high and the reason they were all going to California is because California does this. California offers all sorts of benefits to anyone who comes here illegally. It's an incentive. Come to California. We'll take care of you. You don't need to work. We'll pay you. And you can send that, what you don't use yourself, you can send back to Mexico to your family. Now, I have no problem with an immigrant, a legal immigrant, coming to this country, working hard, getting a job, living frugally, and sending money back to the family in Mexico. That's the American way. That's how my great-grandfather came here, from Italy. He found a person who would sponsor him here in Denver, and he came here. He left his wife and 2 children, came here, got a job as a janitor, but became stable enough to save up enough money to have his wife and 2 kids come over here. Now, those 2 kids died in the pandemic, in the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918. My grandmother and her siblings, the ones that I grew up knowing, were all born here. They were American citizens born here. My great-grandfather got his citizenship, paid for his citizenship. He was a janitor at a lawyer's office downtown Denver. He paid for his citizenship because in Italy, his family were winemakers. He was known as the person to go to see to get wine. And so he paid for his citizenship with wine. I am offended that the federal government would even consider giving benefits that are specifically for citizens to not just non-citizens, but to illegal non-citizens. That's an offense to me. As an American, that's an offense to me. But this is what she would like to do. Number 5, the Uplift Our Workers Act would direct the Department of Labor, in collaboration with the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, to create a worker-friendly score, they put that in quotes, similar to the LEED certification for federal contractors. This score would consider factors including, but not limited to, paid family leave, scheduling predictability, hourly wage, and union membership. Thereafter, the Department of Labor and OMB are to provide federal agencies with recommendations on how to evaluate and give systemized preference to worker-friendly contractors as it makes contracting decisions. So only contractors who follow this Uplift Our Workers Act policy would get contracts from the federal government. Because that's how the government forces you to do what they want. If they may not have the power to put anybody in jail over something, the 55 mile per hour speed limit. How did they force each state into it? Well, they said, well, if you don't lower your speed limits to 55 miles an hour, we're not going to give you federal money. So every state lowered their speed limit. And for years, no matter where you traveled, the speed limit was 55 miles an hour. Now, you live in Colorado. If you've traveled anywhere outside of the Denver metro area, you know how long of a trip that is, especially if you're going east. If you're going east and you're not doing 75, 80 miles an hour, you feel like you're standing still. Number 6, the sixth of 6 bills. A just society guarantees the economic, social, and cultural rights of all. This resolution would direct the Senate to give its advice and consent to the ratification of the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This covenant recognizes the right to just and favorable conditions of work, the right to form trade unions, the right to adequate food, clothing, housing, and the right to be employed of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So they're going to legislate that you must have a job and that it must be adequate pay, that you must be able to attain the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, which means that if you can't afford it, you should still be able to get it. And I agree that healthcare is a huge priority, but I have a solution to that. Just put pricing up front. Allow the patient to become the customer again, so that for non-emergencies, certainly, you can shop around. You can find out what doctor or medical center is charging the least amount for the most services, so that you can get your money's worth or feel like you're getting your money's worth. For emergencies, hopefully you've already done some of your shopping around. Otherwise, you're probably going to be stuck with a really big bill. But it already works. We've seen this. LASIK surgery. You can't get insurance to pay for that, but millions of people get LASIK surgery every year, and they don't pay a massive amount for it. And the reason they don't pay a massive amount for it, hell, in fact, I have heard commercials. I haven't heard them recently, but a year or so ago, I was listening to commercials on the radio, LASIK surgery for as little as $250 per eye. Can you imagine doing anything for $250? You know, which is more delicate? Eye surgery or removing a lump of skin from my nose? Because this lump of skin is worth $7,000 to $10,000. But I can get my eyes fixed. If I needed my eyes fixed, I could get them fixed for $500. Because insurance doesn't cover LASIK. Won't pay for it. But insurance might pay for removing this lump of skin. Most likely won't, but might. But because it might, they're charging $7,000 to $10,000. That's beside the point. So, along with AOC, we've got her buddies in Congress, the Squad. And their idea is called the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act. And I've got a link to stories for the Just Society and also to this. And this is legislation that is put out by Representative Omar and her fellow Radical House Squad members, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, and Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts. They all co-sponsored this bill, along with 3 other progressive Democrats. And what this bill does is that, as it says here, the squad is determined to take maximum advantage of the suffering caused by the pandemic in order to create a large socialist bureaucracy. Rahm Emanuel, who was in President Obama's administration, famously said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." And the government doesn't. And the thing of it is that they're going to use the pandemic as an excuse to basically remove your rights as a property owner and find ways to make it more attractive to sell your properties, especially if they're not your primary home. If you are renting houses to other people, currently that income is nearly tax-free because you're doing what the government wants. You're providing housing to people. And so the government incentivizes you by taxing you much less. This is a good incentive. What this would do is it would set up funds to pay people to sell their properties to the government. So the government could create, and it would create another fund, so the government could create low-income, affordable housing for those who can't afford rents. And the problem is that this kind of bureaucracy, if it were enabled, would be difficult, if not impossible, to tear down, even when the pandemic ended. Because there's nothing... Who was it that said there's nothing quite so permanent as a temporary government measure? I don't remember who said that. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, it absolutely true. So this article that I'm going to link to makes the argument that if Omar and her progressive friends really cared to solve the immediate problems, they would push to have people go back to work. It's the easy and right thing to do. Instead, this bill would punch a hole in the Constitution. Landlords would not be allowed to take any adverse action against renters. If they did, they could be subject to fines, and ultimately they could lose their property. The federal government would have expanded powers to outright seize private property if the landlord did not follow the draconian rules. Landlords would be forced to permit tenants to live rent-free, and if they applied for relief funds, their property would become compromised. If the landlords applied for relief funds, their property would become compromised. The government would then have the right to seize it. This is not what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they first envisioned a free country, free of tyranny, free of draconian rule, free of the whims of others without representation. Unfortunately, while we can't say we're without representation, what I can say is that many of the representatives others have voted in to represent them are not representative of me. And I think you'll agree, they don't represent you either. Unfortunately, they along with their friends in Congress have the power to do whatever the hell they want. This is not what this country was founded on. This is not how the Founding Fathers envisioned it. When asked back in 1776, what did we have? A monarchy or something else? Benjamin Franklin famously replied, "We have a republic, if you can keep it." We have been able to keep it for 240 odd years. To varying degrees of success. Happy birthday, America. I hope you have many more. I truly do. And if you're as tired of this crap as I am, maybe it's time to stop doing the same thing you do every 4 years. Stop voting for Republicans. Stop voting for Democrats. Start voting for someone else. Someone who actually will make a difference. Someone who actually will bring change. A disruptive element. I absolutely claim to be a disruptive element. I think shaking things up, shaking up the status quo, is what this country needs. Yeah, it might be a little painful. certainly for those who I'm shaking up. But I remember a time when the country was much freer than it is now. You know, there's a list. I'll have to see if I can find it. There's a list online that shows the top freest countries. If I remember correctly, the U.S., I don't think the U.S. falls in the top 10. Not anymore. We used to be number 1, number 2. We've fallen down that list because of the Democrats and their socialist policies, the Republicans and their socialist policies. There really isn't much difference between the Democrats and Republicans anymore. They're both going to spend your money as quickly as they can, or they're going to create as much as they possibly can. That's happening now. President Trump and his Treasury and the Fed. The Fed isn't even a government agency. They're printing money as fast as they can. Money printer, go brrrr. That's going to end well. So like I said, if you're ready for something different, you have to vote for someone different. Happy birthday, America. You have a wonderful holiday weekend.